One of the things we really try to emphasize in our classes and while coaching is that Scrum is referred to as a framework. We don't call it a process. Not that processes don't exist. Processes do need to be created, but in the complex world, we want the ownership of the process to live with each team, because a process that works for one team likely won't work for the other team, even if they're building, similar type of things. So what we emphasize is framework. So a framework is something that's minimally sufficient. Think of a framework for a house. You don't change the framework, but the framework has to be appended to, it's added to. And that's what Scrum is. It's described in a 18-page document in the Scrum Guide. And we want them to take ownership of a process, and by providing them with a framework, we can achieve that. Because if they don't own their process, if the process comes to them, then the opposite of owning is like renting. So imagine you rent a house and something goes wrong with it. The fridge is running way too loudly. So what you end up doing is you call the landlord. And you kind of take a stance of a victim, right? It's like, hey, I pay you good money every single month. I'm on time. I expect you to come out and fix this thing tomorrow. But if you own a house, your behavior is quite different. When you own something, you have to deal with it. So maybe you don't fix it right away, but you take other things into account. So do I fix the fridge? Well, I guess it depends. What's the cost? What's on TV tonight, right? There's a lot of different decisions or reasons I would make these decisions when I take ownership of something. So we want people to own, not rent. And so one of our big mistakes our customers make quite a bit, and you can see how it happens, is when they start out with Scrum, they want to start with a pilot project. So they'll send them to some training, maybe they'll read the small Scrum Guide, they understand the framework, I suppose. But when they go to implement it, this first pilot team, they realize that not everything's laid out for them. So they got to go figure some things out. They try, they experiment, they stumble, they fall, they get back up. But eventually, a few sprints into it, they hit on a process that really works for them. Now, that's not the mistake. That's how Scrum is meant to happen. The mistake is made when we then look at that team and see them as a success, and then we try to replicate it across the organization. And so we ask them all these questions about, more details about what tools they use and the timings and the agendas and all that. And then we put them down into a list and we roll it out to the rest of the organization. And we come to the rest of the organization and say, here's how we do Scrum at company XYZ. Here's how long our sprints are. Here's what time we do our daily Scrums. Here's what an agenda for a review looks like. But what we're actually doing, the mistake is we're handing them not the framework, we're handing these other teams a process that they don't own. So they end up in a renting mode, in a victim stance. And then they start to blame. They blame management for forcing it on them. They blame the other team for doing it. They blame Scrum. And this is something we notice quite a bit. In fact, if you just Google "I hate Scrum" out there, you'll see blog post after blog post of all these bullet points that really aren't talking about the framework itself. They're referring to how it was implemented within their organization and how it was forced upon them. They're talking about story points. They're talking about how unsustainable the pace of a sprint is. They're talking about user stories, none of which are mentioned in the Scrum framework. So what we're trying to do is, by introducing a framework, create ownership rather than renting. And the hardest thing to do is, when you see success with one team, is to wipe that process down to the bare bones framework again, and then hand it to another team so that they can learn the same lessons.